right, we're going to start out here today in Matthew chapter 16, and we're going to look at today some of these groups today and next class period. We're going to see some of the groups of churches, groups of people who identify as kind of as groups, but not really some of them. We're going to see that the true church of God has always been there. The true church of God. There's always been churches, individual, local assemblies, who continued to hold to the truth and who continued to fight against false teachings of, especially of the Catholic Church. Okay, so as we start in Matthew chapter 16 today, let's look at this story of Jesus at Caesarea Philippi, and you'll remember us talking about this. Verse 13, when Jesus came to the coast of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, "Whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" And they said, "Some say that thou art John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." He saith unto them, "But whom say ye that I am?" And Simon Peter answered and said, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed that unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven. And I say also unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." So the church, the true church, will be under attack. Okay, the true church will be under attack, but it will not be prevailed against. Okay, the word prevail has to do with a battle, has to do with warfare. And so the true church of God is under attack and will be under attack. Go on to the next verse. "And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." So the church of God is an important institution, local churches. As I studied for this lesson and next week's lesson, I'm very saddened in some ways. Saddened that there's not more information about the true churches of God. Most of the information that we have is from the Catholics and their side, their accusations, their lies about the true churches of God. So we're gonna look at several groups today of people. We're going to start with the ones in your book, and I'm going to end actually with a group that's not in your book, at least not yet anyway. But there's so much to be seen here. I am thrilled with the idea of looking through this, and I can't wait to get back after Candy Sale and study out some more of these groups. Very, very, very interesting. I hope you learn some things in your paper that you'll be doing. If you can do one of these groups, that'd be great. I'll give you some more names here. We'll talk about many of these even today and next week. But let me here mention a plug for David Cloud's Fundamental Baptist CD digital library or something like that. How many of you have that you know of? No? Okay. I forget. When he was here a couple years ago, he was selling those, and they were, I think it was $50 for this CD, and it was loaded. Had all, of course, it had all his writings on it, which, that's good, but that's not as valuable as these things I'm going to mention. But on there also, there are many books old, out-of-date, reprinted, now in digital form books about church history. Okay, so he is a huge, avid fan of church history. And so I'm pretty sure, I'm sure that we have to have that and sell it in our bookstore. I don't know if it's $50 anymore. But anyway, there's just so much to study out of that, and you can do your nice easy word searches and find your group that you're looking for, and there it is in all the books. Each one of the books is listed out, where it's found, and so on. Really easy to study that way. So, I'd like for you to turn now to page 45 in your book. These are some examples of sound churches, and we're not just going to look at the time of the Ante-Nicene period, or necessarily even right after that, Constantine and so on. I want to give you some examples this morning of churches, true people of God, who continue to go after the truth and continue to stand against error. And anyway, so it'll be, for me, a very interesting study. We're going to look at several of these. The first one that's listed is the group of churches called the Novatians. The Novatians. This group is named after an elder in the church, and he was an elder in the Church of Rome who saw a lot of impurities in the church, and so he decided that he was going to, with his church, he was a bishop, he decided with his church he was going to stress purity. He had seen that there was no spiritual requirement on page 46 for church membership, that the members would renounce Christ in times of persecution. Remember, the church at this time, churches still are under the persecution of the Roman Empire, not the Roman Catholic Church. And when the persecution ceased, they would again seek church membership with no evidence of repentance and regeneration. So these people would recant, and then as soon as the persecution ended, they'd come back like everything was okay. As people are getting killed, others, and here these people just come back as if nothing happened, He also, let's see here. The apostate elders replaced the power of godliness with a mere form thereof, inventing vain rituals that combine paganism with Christianity. We're going to talk about a little bit today, but especially later on, the controversy of Manichaeanism. Okay? What? Manichaeism. Yes. Manichaeanism. Which is basically the argument that you can combine pagan rituals with Christianity. And so we'll see that come up a lot. That the Catholics, think about this, the Catholics accused all their enemies of Manichaeanism, combining pagan rituals with spiritual things. That is their most common, as I studied through, that is their most common charge against these groups. Talk about the pot calling the kettle black, right? Talk about one who's guilty calling one who's innocent guilty. Okay? So, number 3, in about AD 250, Novatian opposed the election of Cornelius, and that was kind of the final straw. Failing in this effort to keep this guy out of the Church of Rome, Novatian led many churches to separate from the Roman-dominated churches. Now, he's a bishop. Okay, he's over multiple churches. Is that scriptural? I don't believe so. The Bible doesn't teach that. New Testament doctrine doesn't teach that. And but at least he's making a step in the right direction. The Novatian churches flourished in several parts of the empire, and many others saw his example and stepped out in rejection of common church doctrine. Can't really call them Roman Catholic yet at this point. The doctrine of the Novatians. They believed in sound apostolic doctrine. Now what is that? That's in opposition to, right? In opposition to church fathers' doctrine. It talks about the Trinity. The independence of the church. They believed in the autonomy and the independence of the church and rejected prelacy. They held to the independence of the church and recognized the equality of all pastors in respect to dignity and authority. John Christian. So they believed in indigenous churches, right? They believe in independent churches. They believe that the church members should be saved. I know that sounds ridiculous to us, but if you're bringing in infants, primarily this is where the issue was, if you're bringing in infants, they haven't chosen to be saved. If you're forcing people to become members of your church, they're not saved. So the whole point is that they ought to choose. This ought to be a voluntary thing, not a forced thing. They were called the Cathari. That's a Greek word that means pure. There's many groups later that are called by this same, at least the sub-name of groups, is the Cathari, the pure ones. Okay, those who wanted to purify the church. Moral purity of their churches and their separation from the world. They practiced rebaptism. They practiced, or they rejected pagan practices. And then they're called Manichaeanism, or Manichaeanists. Manichaeans, there we go. Their persecutions. These rebaptizers should be punished by death. Now the Novatians, let's see here. Some of these false there's not many, sorry, I'm thinking of the next one. But he mentions here false accusations against them. The Novatians are called the children of the devil by Cyprian. He's one of the early church fathers. They're called the children of the devil. I mean, what did they do to earn a name like that? Well, they try to follow the Bible, you know. They try to, you know, they think that people should be saved if they're going to be members of the church. Okay, and they're children of the devil. The Catholic Church, even today, heaps abuses upon their memory. I understand that you can go in, not you, but leaders of the Catholic Church can go into the Vatican, and there are just huge libraries in the Vatican of books from the early church fathers, many of them original. And you can go and see their actual writings, their church doctrine, you know, the formation of their church doctrine. And of course, they write about these kinds of groups who came up and challenged the church and how heretical they were and so on. I'm going to read to you a lot in a little bit, but there's so much reference to the heretics. Just remember, when the Catholics write about heretics, they're writing about me and you. Okay? So always remember that. Don't be afraid to be called a heretic. I know the Bible talks about heretics. If the Bible calls you a heretic, you got a problem. But if the Catholic Church calls you a heretic, you're doing something right. Okay? So keep it up. Alright, the next group that's listed here is the Donatists. The Donatists. Now, I'm going to hold off on this one. Next week, I'm gone on Tuesday. And on Schoology, you're going to read a portions of a book that David Cloud reproduced. Anyway, it's not going to be a huge amount, but there'll be some reading for at least an hour and a half or so worth of reading. And questions. So I'm going to take portions of that. Their main what the Catholic Church said about them, and then what they actually believed, some of their background and history, of course, at the beginning, and then some of the persecutions that they endured. Okay, so anyway, that's the next. It's not a class period technically because I'm going to be gone. So next Tuesday there is no class in here. What we'll do instead is I'll have that on Schoology. You can go to the library sometime on Tuesday. I would encourage you to do it during this class period. Go to the library and pull it up and read it and answer the questions. What it is, though, it's a book called The History of the Donatists. And what has happened, and what I'm going to read to you, and I hope not to bore you too much, but what has happened is during these early years, the Catholic Church said all of these things about these groups, and false accusations which for years were considered to be true. And then finally, people in the time of the Reformers started saying, wait, I wonder if there were actually groups who always did follow the truth, like Matthew 16 tells us. In other words, is the Bible actually true? That the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church, the true church? Or are there big expanses of time during the medieval times where there were no true churches, where everything was Catholic? And they started looking into these groups and finding some writings and some things, not nearly as much as the Catholic Church, but some things. And now in the 17 and 1800s, there's some very good authors who started putting these things together. And that's where that book, The History of the Donatists, comes from. And it's a vindication of these groups. There's not as much on the Novatians, but some of the other groups I'm going to read to you is about the Albigenses. And we'll talk about that group. I like what they did. They had lots of very good things about them. So, anyway, so the Donatists, history of the Donatists. By the way, you can't touch them yet. But in the library, in that section of books, the David Cloud's old book section in there are books on these specific groups. And some of the books that we're talking about, even the history of the Donatists, that book is in the library. One of the copies of the book, out of print, of course. Okay, go to page 52. Page 52. Now, I'm not going to go through all the details of the Paulicians, but look at the bottom of page 52. I want you to see there's a section there called Other Names. Other Names. Look at that. The Paulicians were also called, excuse me, Albigenses, from the name of a town in France. Paterine, which means the low breeds. Thanks. We like being called that name. The lower order of men. What does the Bible say in Acts? The men of the baser sort. I think that was a different type of people there, though. The Bible called them baser sort, not the Catholic Church. The Cathari, the Gazari, which is a corruption of Cathari. The Bulgarians. These are true churches in Bulgaria. The Bogomils. These are churches in Bosnia, Herzegovina, Slovakia. Churches that continued to fight against the Catholic Church, fight against the Orthodox Church in their cases. Churches that continued to stand for the truth. Were they wrong in certain things? Of course. Were they Baptists? That's where, I know people who, personally some people who say, well, Baptist is all, Baptist with a capital B, capital A, and they go through the whole thing, Well, I'm Baptist, but I'm a Bible believer, I believe, first. And Baptists people of churches of Baptist doctrine go by different names around the world. And what I'm naming to you are some of these groups who are Baptistic in doctrine. That's not your Bible believers. They just believe the Bible, you know. They stand for the truth. But the Bogomils and then Bonnet Hummins, however you say that, that's got to be French, right? But the point is, there are many, many groups of Bible believers. And so we can, and we're not talking little groups. We're not talking one or two churches. There's records of the Catholics killing 80,000 over a period of 100 years of different groups. 80,000, 100,000, 50,000. There's, you know, they would go on all-out attack against these groups. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. They continued to, in many cases, they were moved. They had to leave their country, their homes, to go somewhere else. But the gates of hell did not prevail against them. Okay, let's look at a little bit about the Paulicians before I take you to the Albigensians. These are different groups. And understand here also, I think I better stop and explain this. It's not like they identified, they said, you know, we're this new denomination, we're called the Paulicians. Usually they were given this name after they'd been in existence for a while. They just believed the Bible. They were local groups, local assemblies, trying to follow the Bible. And they would have some identifying characteristic about them. Like the Albigenses. They're from the town that's in Italy by that name. Okay? The Cathari, the pure ones, they didn't call themselves, we are the pure ones. No, they were given that name. The Paulicians, what? Paul. They followed the Apostle Paul's writings, which is a good place to start if you're going to follow a New Testament church. So, on and on. These are not groups, you know, like a denomination at all. These are churches who were just trying to follow the truth, and they were given these names according to identifying characteristics about them. Let me give you a quick example of that. When we first got saved out of the Amish, we didn't know anything about denominations or cults or anything like that. All we knew is that there were two main doctrines that we believed in that were in opposition to the Amish church. One was that we believe in eternal security. We found the Bible teaches eternal security. And the second thing was that we found, even before eternal security, that the Bible teaches salvation by grace through faith alone. That's it. And so, when we got saved, when my parents got saved, we just started meeting. Our family, 4 other families, we started meeting. We're having church together. And the Mennonites invited us to come to their church. So my parents went, and they right away said, no, that's too close to the Amish. And that's obviously against the Bible. I mean, they're sitting there arguing about whether a woman should have a covering on her head. And the Bible's very clearly not for, you know, it doesn't say you have to have that, I don't believe, and we didn't believe. And on, several other things. So then the Mormons invite us. So my parents went to the Mormon church. They went, oh no, they right away knew that was loony. They didn't agree with that. Why? Because of the Bible. And then they went to the Charismatic church. You know, these are all people inviting them. You got to come to our church. We believe just like you do. And so they go there and find out they didn't believe like us. So we were content to stay there and all of us just meet in our homes. And, you know, we didn't know everything. We didn't know much at all, to be honest with you. But we knew the Bible. We had my parents had some discernment. And all of a sudden, here comes a letter in the mail inviting us to a Baptist ordination. So my parents went to the ordination. And of course, if you know ordinations, and where most of the time, you know, they ask them all these questions publicly. I mean, it was the perfect service. So my parents standing there, or sitting there, and hear this guy telling what the Baptists believe, what he believes. And they said, it's right down our alley. That's the Bible. That's what we believe. And instantly, we became Baptists. But the reason was because we were Bible believers. So just like that, now I'm a Baptist, not because my parents were Baptists. I'm Baptist because that's what the Bible, Baptistic beliefs are what the Bible teaches. Okay? About salvation. Well, should I go through the whole list of, what's it called? Systematic theology. I won't do that here, though. Okay? Everybody understand what I mean by that? So we follow the Bible. And there are churches throughout history, back to the time of Christ, there are many, many, many churches just like that, who followed the truth, even though they weren't called these, Baptist churches. They didn't have big fancy buildings. They didn't have bus ministries. They didn't have a lot of things, but they followed the truth. Okay, so let's go to the Paulicians. Let's mention some things about them. As with the Donatists and the other New Testament churches of that era, most of the information we have on the Paulicians comes through their enemies. The Greeks, several Greeks wrote against them. An old book written by the Paulicians called The Key of Truth was discovered in 1893 and published in English translation. Conybeare, the one who discovered it, did much original research into the Paulicians and published his findings together with his translation of The Key of Truth. Okay, so you understand what this is. He found their actual writings of what they said about themselves, instead of what the Catholic Church said about them or what the Greeks said about them, some Greeks. In that book, and this is a key book, no pun intended, a key book in understanding some things about the Paulicians, The Key of Truth, they trace their own heritage back to the apostles, but many historians start their history with Constantine. That's not the Constantine emperor. This is a different Constantine, a preacher in AD 660. This man, Constantine, obtained a copy of the New Testament and became zealous for the apostolic faith, contended with the Catholics that the Scriptures alone. Because of his zeal for the doctrine of Paul, he and his followers were given the name of Paulicians. They even changed their names to names of people who were in the Pauline epistles. Silvanus, Titus, Timothy. I wonder if they had any Tychicus. And, Epaphroditus. And people like that. They named their congregations after the names of churches in the New Testament. Okay, this guy, they're really intense about the Pauline epistles. Okay, the churches spread rapidly as the preaching of Constantine was blessed to the Lord. The congregations were the provinces of Asia Minor to the westward of the Euphrates. That's how they describe themselves. Through Antioch and Palmyra. Palmyra is in Syria. By the way, that just was in the news a couple days ago. Those ancient arches were blown up by ISIS. Very nice job. Sorry, jokers. Through Antioch and Palmyra, the faith must have spread to Mesopotamia and Persia. That's north of Israel, all along north of Israel. Asia Minor, Antioch, Palmyra, Mesopotamia to the northeast. Mount Ararat. Excuse me. The church is in the Taurus range of mountains. That's Paul was from the Taurus range of mountains. Tarsus of Cilicia. It's in the Taurus mountains. Those churches formed a circular dam into which flowed the early Paulician faith to be caught and maintained for centuries. What a great picture. The earliest center of Christianity was in Armenia was at Turin, the constant home and base of operations of the Paulicians. Bulgaria, Bosnia. What did they believe? These heretics. Here's what they believed. They accepted the Scriptures alone. You say, well, I thought that was Martin Luther and the Reformers only. No. And I'm not saying Martin Luther is along the line necessarily of, the gates of hell shall not prevail against the true church. I have a hard time accepting some of his other teachings as teachings of the true church, if you want to call it that. But No, this teaching is a teaching of true churches all through history. Only the Scriptures. They held a sound doctrine. They believed in a regenerate church membership. They rejected infant baptism and rebaptized those who came from it. What's the rebaptizing? What do you think of there? The Anabaptists who rebaptize. Look at on page 54, letter C there. A Paulician named Gundolphus, who was condemned by a Catholic council in 1025, testified against infant baptism in these words. Here's what he said. Because a strange will, a strange faith, and a strange confession do not seem to belong to or to be of an advantage to a little child, who neither wills nor runs, who knows nothing of faith, and is altogether ignorant of his own good and salvation, in which there can be no desire of regeneration, and from whom no confession of faith can be expected. That's why I don't practice infant baptism, he's saying. They don't have any clue what's going on. I can testify to that for my own kids. They have no clue. Now, do you agree with that? Surely, of course. Look at the next paragraph. A confession of faith, the truth of the Paulicians in 1024 declares, in the beginning of Christianity, there was no baptizing of children, and their forefathers practiced no such thing, and we do from our hearts acknowledge that baptism is a washing which is performed in water and doth hold out the washing of the soul from sin. I don't know if I agree with that last statement, but the point is, infant baptism, they rejected it. They believed in holy living. They believed in the autonomy of the church. They believed in liberty of conscience and freedom of religion. They were great missionaries. Okay? All right, go to page 56. False accusations. Now, this is common. All right, this is common. Well, I'm not going to do this. In an attempt to heap reproach upon the Paulicians, their enemies brought many accusations against them. Look at this, what they charged them with. Manichaeanism. There it is. We have seen under the section in the first centuries, well, we didn't look at it much, but Manichaeanism is a strange mixture of paganism and Christianity. And the Roman Catholic authorities were in the habit of charging any group they could, such as Albigenses, Paulicians, Waldensians, with the air of Manichaeanism, even though there is no evidence that they held such false doctrines. I'm going to read to you several passages that the Albigenses spoke out against, defending themselves, saying, that's not us at all, we don't believe that. Have you ever been accused of believing something that you didn't really believe? Okay, I think we've all been there. People misunderstand us, or they read into something and they just assume the worst. Many faithful historians of the Waldenses have defended them against this charge. Even if some who are called by those names did hold Manichaean views, it's apparent that most did not. Okay? I'll wait. The charge of not accepting the Old Testament. There's another false accusation. Now, I know that's really easy to see, right? Because they held to New Testament teaching for the church, they're accused of rejecting the Old Testament. I've been accused of that before. You know, you guys just think that the church is everything. The New Testament is everything. You just reject the Old Testament. No. No, Paul didn't do that. Wherefore the law is holy and just and good, Romans chapter 7. The Old Testament has plenty of things. What's it primarily for now? Examples. Examples. For ensamples to those that should come. So they were accused of not accepting the Old Testament. Jones has this to say about them. Very good author. I forget the first name. I think I even have it over here. One of their imputed errors is that they rejected the whole of the Old Testament writings, a charge that was also brought by the rise of Catholic school against the Waldenses and others. But this calumny, this accusation, is easily accounted for. The advocates of popery, to support their usurpations and innovations in the kingdom of Christ, were driven to the Old Testament for authority. See? The Catholic Church are the ones going to the Old Testament for authority for the church, which doesn't apply. It's totally different. And so because the Paulicians don't do that, they're accused of rejecting the Old Testament. When their adversaries rebutted the argument, insisting that the parallel did not hold, for that the kingdom of Christ, which is not of this world, is a very different state of things from the kingdom of David, their opponents accused them of giving up the divine authority of the Old Testament. You know, it's all in who's writing the history, isn't it? That's what it boils down to. Who's writing the history? Who's telling us what's happening? And why are they telling us these things? Right? Remember those questions we asked at the beginning. So, there's so much of church history that isn't history. It's false. You understand what I mean? Because it's in who's writing. It's the Catholic Church that's writing most of the history. We have in our library a lot of Catholic church history. Did you know that? That's why we have signs at the beginning of the books that say we don't support everything. We do. But that because there's a lot of historical fact or truth in there, there's also a lot of theological truth, falsehoods that are wrong, that are in there as well. We have Catholic encyclopedias. So why do we have those? So you can see what the Catholics believe. So you can see what they say. So you can see where these teachings that we're facing today, where they came from. You understand? So many false teachings, you say, my goodness, where did they get that? Or why do we always teach on, salvation, though, right? How people are actually saved, and how baptism should be done, and how the Lord's Supper should be done, and why foot washing isn't an ordinance, and on and on. Why do we do that? Because, or why do we teach about the pastors and the elders being the same thing, and the bishops? And why do we make such a big deal about that? Well, read the Catholic Encyclopedia and you'll see why we make a big deal about it. Alright, and then their persecutions, you can look through that. One of the leaders was cut into 2 pieces with an axe. In those days, the entire group of Paulicians was burned to death in an enormous funeral pile. Look at number 4. It's estimated that 100,000 Paulicians were put to death in the 9th century. You can see the underlined section. It's been estimated that 1 million of the Paulicians died by martyrdom in Bulgaria, Bosnia, and Herzegovina between the 8th and the 15th centuries. 1 million. Can't even comprehend how many that is. Okay, let me take just a minute to get this opened and set up. I want to read to you a few things just to illustrate some more about the Albigenses. This is a group that came later on, a little bit later on. Can't remember my password. Here we go. All the way to the top. This is a book written by Peter Allix, A-L-L-I-X. Originally it was written in 1690. Okay? 1690. So what this is, and by the way, this Peter Allix, he has several other books about different groups. So if you go to our library, eventually, in the old book section, you will find some books by him. Okay, He's a great authority on some of these groups. He was looking to defend them from the accusations of the Catholic Church. Who's Peter Alex? He lived from 1641 to 1717. He has a big series of volumes called The Introduction to the Church History, Research, and Archives. He was born in France, 1641, died in London. He was not a Baptist. He was, however, a scholar and historian of the Church of England. He penned 25 published works, including the 2 histories on the churches of Piedmont, which is an area in where? Did you say where it is?
It's sandwiched in between Italy and France.
France.
Like along the mountain line that comes.
Yes. And then also the Albigenses. These 2 works are widely accepted and treasured by Baptists, especially because these are true churches of God. William Jones. I knew I had that name somewhere here. And so here's what he did. He wrote to the Queen of France. Queen of France, yes. In defense, this is in the 1600s, in defense of these groups who used to be in France. Okay, let me just give you an illustration as it starts out here. To the Queen, may it please your Majesty, this defense of the Albigenses, the ancient and illustrious confessors who some ages ago enlightened the southern parts of France, is laid down at your Majesty's feet for your protection, as well as their successors do now fly into your dominions for relief. What's he saying? We have their successors coming into France, and I'm asking you for their relief. You understand what he's saying by that? So this is the Reformation period. Okay? Towards the end of it, but still. And he's saying, we've got their successors. These are true Christians coming to your dominion, and I'm asking for their relief. That charity which moves your Majesty to protect them by your gracious favor, support them by your royal bounty, makes me presume to offer this historical apology to your sacred Majesty. Okay? So he's writing this to the Queen of France, asking for help. Alright, I'm going to get to chapter 17 here. Alright, I should have read to you several of the titles. Here's one, chapter 16. The Albigenses justified by a conference, whereof we have an account written by Bernard of Foncalve. However you say that name. So, what it is he's defending the Albigenses by this one conference. I'm not going to go through that one. I looked through that some. This is, of course, written in a different language originally than translated. Alright, this one here, the calumnies, the accusations raised against the Albigenses, refuted by the Conference of Montreal. So this is a conference to clear the name. Conference of Montreal. I didn't look up all the details of what that is. But here's what they were accused of. Albigenses were churches of true believers, and they were accused of some of these things. They accused them of novelty. They accused them of being only the disciples of Peter Waldo. Who's Peter Waldo? Supposedly the leader or the founder of the Waldensians. And he was accused of Manichaeanism. He was accused of rejecting the Old Testament. He was accused of sending children to hell, damnation, because he wouldn't infant baptize, and on and on. So they accused them of being the disciples of Peter Waldo, and from thence raised this accusation that they were only a company of laymen. The followers, the Waldensians, were considered the lowlifers. And they were stripped of any authority, man's authority, to preach the truth. And so when these guys are being accused of being the disciples of Peter Waldo, what they're saying is, you don't have any authority to preach either, because we're not giving it to you. You're not part of the true church, the Catholic Church. And he says here, it is certain that they did have a lawful ministry, and indeed 1,000 times more lawful than that of the Church of Rome. They accused them in general of being Manichees, perhaps because formed of the Priscillianists, who were a branch of the Manichees, had a party in that province. In other words, there were some Manichees close by, and so you all were too. We know that. And they just state stuff like that, and I read several times in these conferences, when they're being accused by the Catholic representative, they just stated it as fact. You all are Manicheans. You believe that stuff. We know you do. It doesn't matter what you say. False accusation. They were charged with forswearing themselves before a court of justice. And the hilarious thing, ironic as can be, the Catholic representatives in these conferences would always forswear themselves by the name of God, but not by the name of animals and creatures. They did the very things that they accused all of these groups of doing, and in this case, the Albigenses. They're accused of being Arians, denying the deity of Christ. When the funny thing is, the popish priests ought rather to be accused of favoring Manichaeanism and Arianism. They're the ones who combine pagan and Christian beliefs. The Catholic Church is the one who denied the deity of Christ by promoting Mary. They ought rather to be accused than the Albigenses, who subtly disputed against these heresies. So, what does he do here? He goes into some reasons why the Albigenses are not Manichaeans. I hope I'm saying that right. Let me give you some things that he points out, why the Albigenses are right. The doctrines which they assert in opposition to the Church of Rome were that the Church of Rome was not the Holy Church. Oh, that's a good way to win brownie points with the Catholics, right? You are not the Holy Church. Listen to this, what he goes on to say. Nor the spouse of Christ, but that it was a church which had drunk in the doctrine of devils, the whore of Babylon, which St. John describes in the Revelations, the mother of fornications and abominations, covered with the blood of saints. Now you know why the Catholics didn't like the Albigenses. It had nothing to do with Manichaeanism. It had nothing to do with... It has to do with that they disagreed and called them out. Okay? Secondly, another thing that the Albigenses disagreed with the Catholics, that the Mass was neither instituted by Christ nor his apostles, but a human invention. You agree with that? Sure. The Mass was a human invention. That the prayers of the living are unprofitable for the dead. Okay, now you understand. The Catholics didn't like what the Albigenses believed. That's all. They disagreed. That the purgatory maintained the Church of Rome is no better than a human invention to satisfy the avarice of the priests, to bring in, or to give purpose for the priests. Think about what purpose would there be for a Catholic priest if he didn't have to take the confessions and make prayers for the dead and what was the other thing here? Oh, and yes, prayers for the dead, praying for people to get out of purgatory. There's not any real purpose if you take that away from the priest. That the saints ought not to be prayed unto. That transubstantiation, the Mass, is a human invention and erroneous doctrine, and that the worshiping of the bread is manifest idolatry. I think I like these guys. You understand? These guys identify with us. I mean, everything they said there It sounds like I would, I don't use their words, the avarice of the priests. But it sounds like us talking, other than a few of those fancy words from the 1600s. All right, let me skip this chapter here. Make some reflections on on the previous chapter. All right, here's a chapter entitled "Whether the Albigenses Were Manichees." Let me talk about the Manichean belief. Now, I've used that word a lot. Manichean belief was the idea that, or at least is reputed to be, and this is what they were accused of, that there supposedly are two gods in the Bible. One is the God of good, and the other is the God of evil. And obviously that makes me think of ancient Greek mythology, dualistic beliefs, dualism, one of evil, one of good. And so that, of course, the idea of two gods is very much anti-Catholic doctrine. Catholics believe in one God, they claim. And so, I would dispute that because they worship Mary. But they claim to believe in one God, and so anybody who even in any way gets close to the idea of two gods, of good and evil, anyway, anybody who believes that is against the Catholic Church. And so therefore you believe in, you're not monotheistic anymore, so you believe in multiple gods. And the Albigenses are being accused of that all the time. Okay, and so, the title of this chapter is, "Whether the Albigenses Were Manichees," because they accused the Pope of being the Antichrist. Sounds like something we would say, right? They accused the Pope of being the Antichrist, and so the Pope turned around and accused them of being Manichean. So, what he does in this chapter, he goes through a list of old-time preachers who were Albigenses and sees what they say about the Pope. Okay? And none of them reference anything about the Pope. They don't go accusing the Pope. The point of the chapter is, we're not out here trying to always just blast away on the Pope. We're just preaching the Bible. If you don't like it, tough. These guys stand for truth. And when the Pope, the head of the religious empire, gets in the way, too bad. That's the point of the chapter. These guys are standing for truth, and they don't have respect of persons. All right, that's all I'm going to say. I don't have a lot of things to read there in this chapter. How about this one, chapter 20? Of the morals of the Albigenses and of their ecclesiastical government. Of the morals. Okay, the morals. These people were moral and of the highest character. And the point of the chapter is, if they were liars, then there's many other accusations that would have some ground, have some footing. But because they weren't liars, and because they were not immoral, because they were pious people of the highest nature, then many of those other accusations by the Catholic Church just don't stick. You understand that? The whole book, I skipped a whole lot of chapters at the beginning, because he goes through churches, individual churches, in certain areas, where the Gauls and all these other places, individual churches of Albigenses that were standing for the truth. And he talks about their moral character, that they were good people. They were righteous people. They weren't out terrorizing the towns and so on. They were righteous people. All right, so what are we saying here this morning? These people are true churches of God, even though they're not talked about as much. for about 1,000 years. Think about this. The Bible talks about in the book of Psalms how we're misrepresented, and the people of God, or the devil's people, they seem to get away with things. And the interesting thing that I took out of this was that for about 1,000 years, these groups were defamed, falsely accused, had all kinds of things written about them, and they continued on, and they didn't get their name cleared until the 16 and 17 and the 1800s. Think about that. We're going to be falsely accused. We're going to be misunderstood. We're going to have charges leveled at us that are just plain not true. See, what do? Keep going. Keep going. Don't quit. Don't feel sorry for yourself. These people had all kinds of things happen to them as well, and they kept on fighting. They kept on speaking out, by the way. To me, church history is a challenge to modern-day Christians to get off their couch, get out of their seat, and do something. And stand. These people stood. You hear about the ones who got burned at the stake. Well, not everybody got burned at the stake. What about the ones who just simply stood and maybe weren't killed for it, martyred for it, but at least they kept on standing? I appreciate them as much as if they would have gotten martyred and killed at the stake. So, good lesson on standing. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord. Help us to stand. Lord, help us to be like these people of old, be willing to stand for the truth and speak out against error. Lord, thank you for these examples. What a challenge it can be to us, and it should be to us. Pray that you bless the time as well today. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. You are dismissed.